All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
We are now thrilled to welcome Boston Globe columnist Joan Vennochi to the program. For those of you who don't know Joan, she is a former researcher on the Globe Spotlight team. That team was made famous in the movie called Spotlight, but her work on that team earned her a Pulitzer Prize for a series that she contributed to on the MBTA here in Massachusetts. So Joan is our first guest who has a Pulitzer. No big deal. In addition to that, she has covered city, state, and national politics for the Globe. She's created a business column that's explored the intersection between business and politics, and she now writes twice weekly for the op-ed page in the Globe. Also, as a member of the Globe's editorial board, she helps formulate and write editorials. In addition to that, she is a graduate of Boston University, which, as Ricky pointed out to me before the program, now makes it the third straight BU grad, in addition to Steve Kornacki and Samantha Gross, who have been on the program unintentionally, but credit to BU for churning out some pretty impressive people that cover politics. And most importantly, to me, she is a Suffolk Law grad, and I wore my Suffolk Rams shirt in honor of having Joan on the program. So, Joan, we are thrilled to welcome you to the program. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and go Rams.
Yes, exactly. Love that. Okay, so the reason we invited Joan, as I mentioned, is that she has experience covering both local and national politics, and coming off two episodes where we had Steve to do like the national scale and Samantha to do very Massachusetts scale. Joan felt like the perfect balance as we head into the midterms in just 2 weeks now, to give us her perspective on both national and local politics. So, Joan, I want to start with question of abortion versus inflation as we head to the polls. So after the Dobbs decision came down in late June, Democrats just slowly but increasingly narrowed the gap with Republicans, and it felt like what was once going to be a red wave now might actually be maybe a little bit red, but maybe on a good night a little bit blue. And it seemed like Democrats had overwhelmingly had an enthusiasm advantage over the course of the summer. That seems to be fading a little bit in the last few weeks as inflation has continued to remain really high and gas prices start to creep back up. And so what was once seemed to be an election about abortion now increasingly seems to be an election about inflation. So what are you seeing? What are your thoughts on that 2 weeks out as we head to the polls? Where do we kind of stand on that tension, and what's on the ballot in a couple of weeks?
Well, I don't want to say I told you so, but right after the Dobbs decision, and everybody was just so, certain that abortion was going to be this rallying cry that would change everything. I mean, I did express some skepticism in a column that I wrote, that it never really has before. And I mean, even I know that what the Supreme Court did was, like obviously an earthquake, but even so, I kind of had my doubts. So, it doesn't surprise me. It's like, timing in life and politics is everything. And maybe if Dobbs, happened last week, it's like the American attention span is so short. And what you feel threatened by, may last a week. And for a while, I think it did seem like that was really carrying some momentum. And now, the gas prices are up, inflation is what everybody is talking about. And that if you look at the polls, and if the polls are telling, the truth, or that flash, that moment in time, yeah, the Democrats are something to worry about right now. It's, it doesn't look too good.
Yeah, it's just remarkable. And again, credit to you. I think you were right. You wrote this column back in the summer about how this was a possibility, but it's just crazy how things shift so rapidly. And it was Republicans up until June, and it was Democrats up until maybe mid-September, October, and now it feels like it's shifting back. And It is just fascinating for people that like to watch it. But speaking of American short attention spans, arguably the most important thing going on in the world this year has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That has come up not at all in these midterm elections, despite the fact that the United States is pouring billions of dollars into Ukraine, and despite the fact that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has contributed greatly to food and energy shortages, which have like contributed to the inflation that we're seeing. So why do you think we haven't seen really any mention of Ukraine during these midterms?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I guess maybe I'll just sort of trace it to my own, sort of reaction to what's happening there. And I don't think it's that different from the average person. When the invasion first happened, I was, sort of consumed by the news, rooting for the underdog, just really, following it and like watching it on the news, reading every story. Then as it kind of got more depressing, I honestly, I started turning away from it. And even though I know it's an incredibly important story and I'm still rooting for Ukraine, um, I have to force myself for a variety of reasons to follow it and pay attention to it. And I think it also again speaks to the short attention span of Americans. We want an ending, like, okay, all right, how is this going to end? Why isn't Putin surrendering? Why isn't it over? And none of this is rational, and it's very superficial thinking. But again, it's kind of the way people think in this country. It's far away. It's affecting us in a negative way in that it's affecting the price of gas in some way. So we just want it to end. At least that's my view of it.
Sure. And just, I guess, a follow-up question on that. Do you see any change coming to US policy towards Ukraine depending on how the midterm shake out?
Well, I saw something yesterday, I guess on Twitter or somewhere, that Kevin McCarthy is saying that if the Republicans get control, of Congress, that they would rethink the aid to Ukraine, which, that would be a huge shift. And that would, if that were to happen, I mean, I'm no expert on war or anything like that, but it seems like it would be good news for Putin. So, yeah, I mean, I think that Ukraine has as much riding on the midterms as anybody else.
Sure. All right. And now I want to kind of shift back and get some of your expertise and perspective on Massachusetts and like the history of the Massachusetts delegation, the two parties here in Massachusetts. So when you, or at least when I think of Massachusetts politicians who at the federal level, you kind of think of these luminaries, these heavyweights like Ted Kennedy and like John Kerry in the Senate, and even in the House, you have people like Tip O'Neill and Joe Moakley and Barney Frank. Where do you see, obviously the Massachusetts delegation is all Democratic right now. Where do you see the Massachusetts delegation nationally? Like how much do we have similar power with people like Elizabeth Warren and Catherine Clark, and maybe we just don't consider them in the same ways? Or do you see us maybe diminishing in a little bit of power because we don't have those, the Kennedys and the O'Neills?
Well, I think that's another interesting question. And I don't want to point out the obvious difference between men and women and how power is perceived, but it could be a little of that. I mean, I think the Elizabeth Warren situation is really interesting. When you think of, when she ran for president in 2020, from like sort of 2016 to 2020, she seemed to be sort of at the peak of her power and a really important national figure. And then, she ran for president. It didn't go particularly well. I think she came in third in Massachusetts, which is her home state, which isn't, like a good showing. So there's no question about it. I mean, that's a reduction in clout. And where she goes from there, I don't really know. I mean, I look at her and I see that she's still a voice on the national stage. She's pushing for, on student debt and on other issues that really matter to her. But is she the voice of the future? I don't know about that. I mean, the Democrats kind of have an age problem, 70 and older crowd. So, on the national stage right now, I don't see her. I mean, I think she's trying to find her footing right now and see if she can get back to where she was. As far as Catherine Clark, in that internal world in Washington, in Congress, I'm sure she's a very important person. But how much visibility she has nationally, how many people know who she is, that's another question. But then again, I don't know. Maybe was Tip O'Neill a household word beyond Massachusetts? He was Speaker of the House. I mean, I think he had a certain amount of clout. It's like a Nancy Pelosi. Everyone knows who she is. I don't think
Right.
Catherine Clark's achieved that altitude.
Right. And so I just kind of want to follow up on that because you wrote a column, I think just a couple of weeks ago, about the Cape Cod bridges and the bringing home the bacon type situation where Massachusetts politicians in the past perhaps were better at that. So that's kind of what I want to get at too, is like the people that we have representing us now, are they able to do what our past politicians have been able to do for us?
Well, of course, that columns like that make me beloved by our delegation. But I think it was a totally fair thing, to ask. In a moment of time, it would be unthinkable to think that Massachusetts couldn't bring home the bacon and get money for the Cape Cod Bridge. I mean, this had the backing of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Baker administration, not to mention the entire delegation. So, yeah, I mean, if you look at it that way, they don't have the clout. I suppose if you go down the list of who got the money, there are probably all sorts of political reasons for why every project got and maybe they poured the money into, sort of purple states or places, thinking about the midterms. I didn't examine it that way.
Yeah.
That would be, the next level of looking at who got the money, that there was probably a political reason behind I'm sure there was a political reason behind every one of those appropriations, but it's still, it was a big project, and the fact that we didn't get it is not good news for Massachusetts.
Do you think there's something about I don't know if it's kind of the recent dynamic, but like the liberal elites having, Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, having that as kind of what people, maybe not necessarily within Massachusetts, but nationally, when they, when you want to dump on Massachusetts or dump on sort of the liberal bastion that we are up here in the Northeast, Cape Cod, and then, by extension, Martha's Vineyard gets into that. Do you think that kind of sort of identity politics, I don't know if that's maybe the right word in this instance, has something to do with how things unfolded?
I absolutely think so. I mean, I think that's an excellent point. And if you did look at the list, I can't remember all of the places, but they tended to be grittier urban places. And it's a lot easier to make the case that they should get a new bridge than a bridge that connects Massachusetts to the Cape and then to the ferry to Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. So that probably did play into it as well. I think what was interesting is that the Massachusetts delegation seemed very blindsided by it, though. They were really confident that they were going to get the money. So either they were led astray or they, took their eye off the ball or whatever, metaphor or cliche you want to use. They were surprised by it, and maybe they shouldn't have been for the exact reason that you just pointed out, that it just didn't make sense in the big political equation to say, yeah, we're going to give this money for a bridge to Cape Cod right now.
And then I guess along those lines, does it feel to you like this is a sort of a new phenomenon in politics, maybe, that, you do have more local congressmen and women, say, an AOC from New York or an Ayanna Pressley here in Massachusetts, that are kind of more concerned almost with national perception of the Democratic Party and things like that than maybe in the past. You were able to be almost a no-name congressperson, but your entire career is focused on how do I deliver for my district and nothing else. Maybe not nothing else, but
yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but then again, like you mentioned, Ted Kennedy, who was able to straddle both worlds. And, maybe again, that was just a phenomenon of the time. He had a last name that, at the time was, kind of magical in, like what it conveyed to people. So he was a national figure. He pushed a national agenda. He was a voice on immigration reform, on education, on things like that. But at the same time, yeah, he also, had the Kennedy compound on the Cape. So you'd be darn sure that there'd be money for the Cape Cod Bridge if he were there. But I agree with you. And I mean, I think the divide in the Democratic Party right now, between the progressives and the, sort of centrist Democrats really, probably explains a lot of what's going on as well. I mean, I don't know. If I recall, I think Ayanna Pressley actually voted against the infrastructure bill because she didn't think it was, was big enough. So when you have, sort of people voting against something that was really important to the Biden administration, I'm not saying they didn't give money for the bridge for that reason, but who knows how much something like that plays into it.
Sure. So to go to the other party here in Massachusetts, or at least what's left of it, what I mean, it would be too obvious to be like, what have you seen over the course of your time here? But could you maybe talk about some of the factors that have driven the Republican Party here in Massachusetts pretty much out of business? We had, as Ricky and I talked about with Samantha, 4 of our last 5 governors were Republicans, and while we are never going to, or never say never, but it doesn't seem likely that we're ever going to be a Republican or conservative state. Republican Party had some heft here in Massachusetts. It has none right now. What are some of the reasons that you have seen for that decline?
Right. Well, I like to, you can describe me as a veteran, which means, another word for being old. So one of the first governor, campaigns that I covered was Bill Weld back in 1990. I think that was the year. And yeah, I mean, he was, like social liberal, fiscal conservative, sort of smart, funny guy who sang songs and, the legislature got along with the Democrats in the legislature. And that's been the model that has worked. What is that, 30 years ago?
Yes.
Guys,
Yeah.
predates you guys, right?
Not quite, but we'll take it.
You'll take it. Well,
Yeah.
you were in preschool or something like
Yeah,
that. Anyway, so that was the model, and it worked really well. He was followed by Mitt Romney, who was a version of that, only not as much fun, to be honest. And he also was, he also used Massachusetts as just a, a stepping stone to make that run for president, where he kind of then revealed more of his truer colors as much more of a conservative, I think, as much more of social conservative than Weld was. But again, he was able to win, and he is responsible for, our healthcare that we have, Romney Care, which became Obamacare. That's, that was, a huge accomplishment that unfortunately, sadly, he ran away from when he ran for president. Then we had Deval Patrick, Hope and Change, who, predated the Obama Hope and Change campaign. Then we had Charlie Baker. So, the Republicans know what model wins here. And this time around, they have deliberately chosen something that cannot win. So, you guys tell me, I mean, where do they go from there?
I think that's a great question. I think it's either you continue doubling down on losing and just want people that want to hang on to power within a diminishing Republican Party, or you see that it didn't work at all and you hopefully start anew and go back to what worked. But
right, I mean, right now they're in the double down mode, right?
Oh, sure.
I mean, they've got like 3 weeks until the election, and they're in the double down mode. I'm guessing that neither of you watched the debate last night between Healy and Deal. I watched most of it, and I didn't watch all of it. And he is, he's trying now to focus. Jeff Deal is trying to focus on the economy. But it's too late because already he has Trump around his neck and he has abortion, and those two things, I mean, the baggage is just too heavy, and he's not adept enough as a debater or a candidate to to offload them at this point. So the question, what happens? Where do they go from here? Does this version of the Republican Party, which is basically on a like a death wish, do they just sort of fade away, and does a new Republican Party emerge from the ashes? I don't know. I don't see I don't see that happening right now, but maybe it could.
Yeah, definitely to be determined after this. So to shift back a little bit to one of the main issues here in the midterms has been crime. And Republicans have been hammering, in addition to inflation, has been crime and immigration, which are classic Republican talking points. But you've written several articles in the last few months about crime here in Boston, and it's also on the rise nationally, of course. Ralph Boyd Jr., who used to be an assistant U.S. attorney here in Massachusetts, and then went on to be the assistant U.S. attorney for civil rights in the Bush administration, came and spoke at Suffolk last week, and he was saying, like, people in Boston are freaking out because you guys are on pace for 40 murders, which is a lot. But he was like, DC is on pace for 300 murders this year. Baltimore, which is small in Boston, on pace for 4. Chicago on pace for 9. So, Joan, like, from your perspective, whether you want to talk about it with Boston or nationally, is there anything that you can like attribute? Is there anything that we're not doing well right now? Like what's going on with these rising crime figures across the country?
Well, I've always been sort of fascinated by the the issue of crime in Boston, because it's always been lower than everywhere else. But I also feel that it's also just like easy to ignore because it seems to happen somewhere other than where we work and go to school. And it just it lets everybody just sort of forget about it and not care about it. Yet to the people who live in those neighborhoods, I mean, I think the last time I wrote, and I'm sure I've written it before, I went to a community meeting, and a woman said one shooting is too many. And when you hear gunshots going off, and even if they're not fatalities, but they're hearing the sounds of guns, and nobody wants to have to live like that. So it's always kind of interested me how we can just sort of sort of separate ourselves from what's happening in a part of our city. Are we doing what more can be done? I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be writing a column.
Yeah.
I'd be giving lectures, or I'd be doing models. I mean, I do think part of what's happened in Boston, I mean, I don't know if you are familiar with what they called the Boston Miracle back in the 90s. You should, if you're not, you should Google it. It was when, I don't know exactly what the numbers were at the time, but homicides were at the high point. And the 10-point coalition, a coalition of ministers and politicians and sort of social justice people, came together and came up with sort of a new mode of policing that became a national model. And it's kind of broken down along the lines of a lot of ego and politics. And some of it, quite honestly, breaks down along the line between the progressives and like another way of thinking about crime, right? That, like what should be prosecuted? Like when do you sort of go a route that's not punitive? And that's really, I think, an internal debate that's going on right now that's divided the city and the stakeholders in how to address this case. And I want to find a way to write about it because I think it's really interesting.
So do I.
Yeah. I think that's the Commissioner Bill Bratton, right? In the
right
broken glass kind of, we're going to prosecute all the small crimes. And yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I wonder maybe a couple of things, and Brendan and I talk about this a lot, just in terms of how some of these ideas, whether it's potentially like the economy or sort of local crime, do elicit sort of who do you hold accountable? And a lot of the times we point towards the federal government, but something like kind of local crime issues are maybe not in that vein. So I mean, I guess this question is a little bit meandering, but like, how high do you sort of feel that the issue of crime is on voters' minds as they're going to the midterms, and how does that come about? I mean, I think one of the more famous cases, of course, like Willie Horton just derailing Dukakis's election chances, right? But so much of that, like these anecdotal evidence that kind of captures people's minds, but may not be really rooted in any sort of actual kind of cause and effect. And
Right, and it's also breaks down along race lines too. The Willie Horton thing, which I, covered when I covered the Dukakis campaign. I'll get to that question, but one thing I just wanted to say, one person that you might want to think about for having on your podcast is, Kevin Hayden, the DA, who he'll be the official DA after this race, because that race between Ricardo and Arroyo and Kevin Hayden is an illustration of exactly that, like these two different worldviews of like how you address crime in a city and what you do about urban violence. And I think Arroyo was on the way to winning until he was derailed by those stories about, like what happened or didn't happen, back in high school, which would be another podcast about media ethics and what's covered and not covered. But at any rate, I mean, that's really interesting. How much does crime factor into the election? Well, the Republicans are trying to make it that. And in states, in those places that you mentioned, like Chicago and Baltimore and, places like that, where the numbers of fatalities are in the hundreds, several hundreds, yeah, I mean, I think it's a mistake, for Democrats to necessarily think that that's not going to, when you live in those neighborhoods and your neighborhood's torn apart by violence, you may have a tougher on crime approach than a lot of Democrats may understand or think. I don't see that really happening right now in Massachusetts, where that's the number one concern. It's easy, as I said, it's easy to compartmentalize and just say it's in a part of the city and it's really not that bad. The number is lower than it was last year. Yeah, we've got to do something, but it's not something that affects my life. So I don't see it really playing into the Massachusetts political scene right now.
Mhm.
I'm meandering now, but I want to make one other point. Okay. I do think that it's interesting. Maura Healey, came in to meet with the Globe editorial board last week. We ended up endorsing her, which is of course no surprise. And Jeff Deal was invited but didn't come, and that's not a surprise either, but I thought it really interesting that she made a big point. Here she is 26, 30 points ahead in the polls. And she still wanted to make sure that the message was, I don't believe in defunding the police. She said that Massachusetts was under-policed. She really didn't want to commit to, we've had police reform, like what more should we do? She kind of ducked and weaved on what should happen. She didn't want to talk about what should happen with the state police. So even here, where crime isn't really in your face every day, there's still, I think, there's still that feeling that she doesn't want to be cast as some ultra progressive person who isn't serious about fighting crime.
Yeah, and I did watch the first debate, and she was actually channeling Charlie Baker, trying to be like, this is actually who I'm like, which was a fascinating dynamic in the whole debate. Just a couple more questions for you, Joan. The first one is, you wrote an article over the summer where I don't think many people paid much attention to this because luckily nothing came of it. But there was the threat of a big strike on railways, and luckily it was averted, and it was averted in large part because the Biden administration intervened. And by the Biden administration, we were talking about former Boston Mayor Marty Walsh, who is now the Secretary of Labor. Not a name necessarily on the top of everyone's lists, when obviously if Biden runs, he's going to be the guy. But if he doesn't run, you have Harris and Buttigieg, who are kind of on the top of people's lists. And then the next would be like Warren or Klobuchar or Booker, people like that. But you said, kind of posed the question, Marty Walsh 2024, is he someone that people, whether in Massachusetts or nationally, should be keeping more of an eye on?
Well, first I want to tell you that the that labor thing is not, it's not over yet. It's not a done deal, because one union has said no. to the deal. And I mean, I was listening to a report on NPR. That's how I'm getting my information. And I guess, like I can't remember how many there are, but they all have to say yes before it's actually approved. And there's no strike and everything's averted, but it's not going to happen till after the midterm. So not to worry. And in the end, it'll probably, they have so much writing on it. They had so much, they did their victory lap. How could they not have it happen? That would look really bad. I think Marty Walsh is an interesting character. I really do. Could he run for president? I don't think so. I kind of wrote that sort of, in a way just to be, provocative, I guess. But there are people around him that I couldn't have written that without people around him, sort of suggesting that there's a place for him on the ticket as a number two, and that he represents the kind of Democrat that Democrats need. He's a local guy. He's a hands-on guy. He's been a mayor. He's got a Boston accent. He's the connection to the working class that the Democrats need right now, because they're been portrayed, and I don't think it's inaccurate, they've been portrayed as the party of the elites, and that you need some ordinary people with extraordinary political skills who, can sort of balance the ticket. Kind of Marty Walsh from Dorchester, really be a vice president? I mean, I don't know. It was just something to sort of fool around with. But people, people are thinking about it. I know Marty Walsh is thinking about it. And I give the guy credit in that he left a job that he loved. He went to Washington, a tough place. And he's a key player in the Biden administration right now. So people should pay attention to him.
Good. And then one final question, and we couldn't let you go without this because this is where you won your Pulitzer covering this, is the MBTA, which is the public transportation system here in Massachusetts. If you live here in Massachusetts, you know very well that it's been more of a disaster than usual the last few months. So, Joan, what can we do about this? Any fixes, any suggestions for the incoming Healy administration? Or,
well, first I want to make clear that when I was on the Spotlight team, it was a team of people, and I was a lowly researcher on that Spotlight team who turned out to be very bad at getting lunches and coffee and stuff like that, and nagged them and harassed them enough so that they let me, do some reporting, and wrote a couple of parts of that series. So, that was a bunch of, it was mostly men there, and they sort of empowered me, or I forced myself onto them. And I'm an Orange Line rider now. Now I take the Orange Line from Oak Grove to State Street or Haymarket if I feel like walking a little bit further. I think it's terrible what's happened with the T. And I think it's terrible, and I've written this, that for some reason, Teflon Charlie Baker, it's not that I think you should blame people, but you should hold people accountable. And for whatever the reason, he's escaped accountability on this, and it's going to fall right into Maura Healey's lap, like what to do about the T. And again, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be writing a column. I'd be a transportation expert. But you can't have a city, you can't have a world-class city without world-class transportation. And I'm not like the biggest world traveler in the world, but I've been to a few places, including Seoul, South Korea, where they have like this amazing transportation system. So I don't know why we can't have it. I don't know why, but somebody ought to do something about it.
Somebody ought to do something about it. That's a great point.
Yeah, it's funny because when you wrote that, I think the tagline I saw about it was, or when you were part of the team that did the investigative reporting, the tagline was like the most expensive, least effective, like major city transportation. Have you seen it? Does it feel like it got any better, or are other places getting worse, or where are we where are we stacking up?
We're still up there. Actually, a couple weeks ago, I think it was in the middle of the Orange Line shutdown, in the ideas section of the Globe, we revisited the Spotlight team story, and I actually wrote a piece that sort of basically said, and went back and talked to some of the players that were alive then and still are older but alive now, and the same problems persist. I think it's the second most expensive in the country now versus the first, number one. But the combination of political interference, unions, and I don't hate unions, but they, do have kind of a stranglehold on the way things are done there and how much things cost. And for whatever the reason, just a lack of, sort of focus on Beacon Hill has the same problems from 40 years ago are persist today. And it's really sad. And to repeat, somebody should do something about it. So
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
do you guys take the tea?
Yeah, I'm a red line guy, so I've always been on the red line
And at BC, you must take the green line, right?
I graduated now 3 years ago, and I'm a bus guy. I live in South Boston, so the 7 bus into the city, or the 11 towards like South End Back Bay.
I just listened in on a committee, MBTA, subcommittee on safety, in which the report, this was just yesterday, the safety officer reported that in the month of August, there were 153 collisions involving buses. So be careful.
Oh, that's not something to laugh at, but actually, yes, be careful. Yeah. Yeah, at least, I mean, Ricky, at least your mode of transportation isn't getting, set on fire, caught on fire every couple of months. So that's something. Yeah.
But yeah, there are a lot of local, so they're like contemplating some changes in the bus route. So a lot of local furor here in Southie around where that 11 is going to run, and if the 7 gets more frequent, it is how the political interference for how the MBTA structures and how it serves the city is fascinating to follow. Unfortunately, it doesn't result in any better service or performance for the riders.
Well, I don't think enough politicians take the tea, and that's part of the problem. So when you take it, and I say that as someone who, for years, the Globe was located on Morrissey Boulevard across from UMass Boston, and I drove to work. So I knew a lot about traffic, but I didn't know much about the T. When the Globe relocated downtown to State Street, which I love, I became an Orange Line commuter, and suddenly I became very interested in how the Orange Line worked or didn't work. So you really have to use it to know its flaws and to want it to realize its promise.
Yeah, and then go to places like Seoul or Tokyo and realize that like other places have figured this out. It can't be rocket science.
Right.
All right, yeah, Joan, that's all we got for you. And so again, thank you so much. That was great. So for the listener out there, Joan was worried about staying too long because she was worried about boring people. I assured her that I was not worried about that at all. And certainly this was not I was not bored once during this conversation. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Well, it was a lot of fun to talk to you, and thanks for thinking of me. So
yeah, no, this was great. And so we'll definitely, if you want to keep up with Joan's reporting, again, she's at the Boston Globe. You can follow her. Joan, where can people follow you? You're on Twitter, right?
I am at Joan_Vennochi and Joan.Vennochi@globe.com.
Beautiful.
So,
yeah. So you can follow her along there. Great. All right. Thanks again, Joan. We really appreciate it.
All right. Have a great weekend. Bye.
Yeah, thanks. You too. Well, that was another treat. She was wonderful, and hearing her perspective and expertise as someone that's been in around Massachusetts, Boston, national politics for 30 plus years was amazing. We continue to feel very lucky that people like this take some time and speak with us. Ricky, if I had like a unifying theme of what she was saying is people vote and people care about what affects them directly. And so just like bouncing off that last point is that people, including you, me, and Joan, don't care about the tea unless we're taking it. And she made the same point with crime, where like you don't really care about crime unless you are the one in your neighborhood is the one that's being affected by it. And I think that goes to the national level too, with inflation versus abortion, where like there are people out there whose lives are being affected by abortion laws, and that's what they care about the most. But there's far more people out there who are being affected by inflation, and that's why it's become the #1 issue over the last few weeks.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a little bit of that, like what is the saying? Like all politics are local.
Local. Tip O'Neill. Who would have put the over under Tip O'Neill references on this podcast?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's like those types of perceptions really feel like they govern what people are thinking when they go into the polls. But I think a little bit onto your question is like nobody's talking about the situation in Ukraine. It's like, well, if we're really thinking about how do we meaningfully tackle inflation, we have to think about this situation that's going on that, as you said, like global energy prices, supply chain routes, a lot of that has to do with what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. But no one's talking about that. But they are saying, inflation is the worst and Democrats are to blame. But what is the solution? No one's offering a solution. And I think that is really just an interesting framing of democracy in general. Like obviously when things are going good, incumbents are, that's an easy answer, is that we just keep if it's not broken, don't fix it. But when it is broken and we don't necessarily have the solutions to fix it, then it's often like, well, whatever, let's just do something different. Yeah. And I think that is that feels interesting. But yeah, to your points, the perception versus like, yeah, what is impacting me today and who do I blame for it is such an undercurrent of just like everything in politics, but often has really nothing to do with the people that we're electing, which is scary. And
yeah, we've mentioned this a million times, like how little the president has to do with the economy. But as history has borne out, presidents are judged by the economy. Like presidents' approval ratings rise and fall with the state of the economy, and we're certainly seeing that this year. And I guess that just goes to a larger question. I think it's frustrating for people like me and you and probably a lot of our listeners who are really tuned into this stuff, where it's like, I actually want to hear solutions instead of just like pointing to the problem on either side. And obviously it's always the party that's out of power that's pointing to, here's a problem connected to the people that are in power. And I think it's a winning message, because if it's not working right now, like you said, let's just do something different in hopes that it'll be fixed magically. But that's frustrating me. I did listen to the first Deal Healy debate, and that didn't teach me anything. No one proposed any policies. It was just like who could hit each other the hardest on different things. And obviously you see the same thing at the national level, where whether it's inflation or crime, like we talked with Kornacki about the Wisconsin race between Johnson and Barnes, and all you hear in that race is like, look, Barnes is soft on crime, and Barnes is like he would greenlight all Joe Biden's terrible economic policies. And it's like, oh, okay, Ron, you are a current senator. Like, well, what are you doing to fix these issues? But like, no one cares about that. And I think it's, like I said, it's frustrating for people that are super tuned into this stuff. But like, we also have to be realistic that the vast majority of Americans are not super tuned into this stuff. And that's not necessarily a criticism of Americans. Again, they have more important things to be doing in terms of like working and feeding their families and all those sorts of things. But like how it takes a really skilled political person to be able to communicate not just a problem, but here's a solution and here's why you should vote for me because I would contribute to this solution.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, I mean, on the sort of the roads and the bridges issue, maybe one area we could have explored a little more with Joan was just like the idea, that Democrats are trying to separate themselves from the stimulus and in large parts now, even some of the large infrastructure bill, because people have in their minds, well, spending equals inflation. But inflation is not just happening here, it's happening everywhere. And in fact, it's probably almost happening less here than in other places, because what you're seeing from a currency perspective is that the US dollar is way up compared to the euro, compared to, compared to like most foreign currencies. Our currency is elevated, which actually, net means that inflation in other places is worse because it's devaluing their currency. While they didn't all do the same kind of spending things that we did here, certainly spending in an inflationary time doesn't necessarily help anything, but it may or may not be the source of the problem. So this is, it's exactly what you're saying. Just like the framing is what feels like politicians are like, that's my moneymaker. As long as I can just say, Democrats tax and spend, spending is inflation. This is, the problem, and the solution is to just not have Democrats. That is an interesting, but like it, I think it is intuitive, regardless of the fact is that it may not actually be true, which I think is better. It's like almost better to just make sense like this, therefore that, than it is to actually be right.
Because the problems are too complicated and the solutions are too complicated and it's too hard to communicate it, right? And so you just seize on messages that people can understand, and that's just politics, right? I mean, that's no criticism of anybody particularly. I mean, the Republicans are doing it more this year because they're the party out of power, but any party that's out of power does the same thing. But yeah, it's certainly like a little bit frustrating. Yeah, and I think this conversation also reminded me of what Steve had said, what he'd be watching when we talked to him, I guess 3-4 weeks ago now, and we said, what should we be watching out for? He was like, what's the foremost thing on people's minds when they go into the polls? And it does appear at this point that Republicans are kind of winning the messaging battle with inflation, crime, immigration. That seems to be more on people's minds. And look, today's Friday the 21st, like, early voting's already started in several states, including like a swing state like Georgia. Early voting starts in Massachusetts tomorrow. We're 2 weeks out at this point, and it'll be, I mean, certainly things can come up in the next 2 weeks. Like, we've seen that in the Georgia Senate race, certainly, and there are things that could start to change people's minds. But as people begin to go to the polls, it seems to be swinging back right, from my perspective.
Yeah, I think that element of it, especially for your quote unquote independents or your undecided voters, in terms of like when they are going to make the decision to vote, I think is an interesting one, because we're now in our like second phase of the remote, or like the real remote voting landscape, which was very much an experiment in 2020. I think continues to be so now, but there are more people who are sort of aware of the options and how to do it. And so I'll be interested to see how, like, if they start, releasing some numbers around who's done the early voting, when did they do it? If they're doing it in the second week of October versus the first week of November, is that having like a material impact, or was it already along party lines? I think it's a lot of fascinating stories that are making this midterm cycle pretty unique. And will be interesting to see if the pollsters are getting it right or sort of wrong, as they have been in the past couple of cycles.
Yeah. Well, Ricky, the next time we talk on this podcast, you might be a married man.
I
didn't mean it like that.
I hope indeed that I will be. Otherwise, I'll be in some trouble. I think I'll be in some trouble.
We'll have to make sure that ring gets here on time.
That's right.
All right. Well, we'll see. We'll talk to people in a couple of weeks, but thank you again to Joan for being on, and for everybody who's listened over our last few episodes. Again, we felt incredibly lucky, and it's been just fun talking to such smart, interesting people.
Yeah, who would have known? BU, the formula for Massachusetts politics.
Absolutely. All right, buddy. Well, I'll see you in person soon, but I'll talk to you about this stuff in a couple weeks.
That sounds good. We'll see you then. Everybody, make sure, if you haven't already, get your plan together for voting. Till then,
go vote. Yeah.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.